Alrighty, so I'm going to tell the story again of the haunted convent in Eganville, Ontario, because I haven't told that story in a while, and there's a lot of new people here. If you scroll down quite a piece, you'll find the story. Anyway, when I told it before, this probably be my third time telling this story on this channel, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I'll tell you what all happened. When I was 12 years old in 1980, myself, my mother, and my young sister, who was only 3 years old, we ended up in a shelter in Eganville, Ontario, which is up north of here. It's in a county called Renfrew County, which is north of here. Anyway, there's a town called Renfrew, and there's a town called Pembroke, and there's different towns up there, bigger towns, but Eganville was a village. It was a fairly big village, but it was still a village. It wasn't really big enough to be considered a town. And in that village, at 68 Queen Street, there was a convent, and it was a former Grey Nuns convent. There was the Grey Nuns convent. There was the school next door, the separate school or the Catholic school. And the church, the Catholic church, was up on the hill behind the school. Anyway, what had happened was the Grey Nuns was a dying order. The nuns had taught actually at the school at one time, but it was a dying order, and they had a convent in Renfrew that was only partly full, and the convent in Eganville was also only partly full. And they couldn't justify maintaining both buildings. So what they did is they decommissioned the convent in Eganville, and they sent the sisters there to the convent in Renfrew. So they amalgamated the two convents is what they did, because they had a lot of empty rooms in both convents, and it didn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, so the convent in Eganville then it was actually bought by an outfit called the Avoca Foundation. And the Avoca Foundation was kind of a charitable organization. And they founded a shelter there for women and children, who were leaving home, basically, or whatever. If you were leaving if a woman was leaving her marriage or whatever, then she could go there. Anyway, at that time it was a fairly new concept. There was the shelter in Eganville where we ended up, and there was also a shelter in the town of Carleton Place, on Mary Street in Carleton Place. That shelter still exists, but it's no longer on Mary Street in Carleton Place. They're now in a different location, which I don't know, and I wouldn't tell you if I did, really, but I can tell these locations because they're old locations, and so they're no longer valid. In fact, the convent at 68 Queen Street in Eganville is gone now. It was torn down a year or two ago, and the school that I went to next door to it, which was called St. James the Lesser School, was also torn down. Only the church remains now up on the hill. And actually, the church had burnt down back quite a few years ago. So it isn't even the same church now that was there when I was there, because it's burnt down. The church that was there when I was there had beautiful woodwork inside of it. It was known for its beautiful woodwork, which unfortunately, of course, was fuel for the fire when it burnt down. Anyway, so the entire thing is different now than it was when I was there anyway. The only thing left is the church, and even it's not the same. The school shut down sometime in the late 80s, and it sat abandoned for over 30 years, and then it was torn down just recently along with the convent. The convent was a beautiful old stone building. It dated from the 1800s. Anyway, Carlton Place was the closest shelter to us, which is a place called Interval House. But Carlton Place, they were full. They didn't have any room. So we got sent to Eganville, to Avoca House. And that's where we stayed until some beds opened up in Carlton Place. And that didn't happen for about 2 months. So we were in Eganville for a couple of months anyway. And anyway, when we arrived there, of course, it's a beautiful old stone building. And we go in for the main entrance, and there's this huge staircase, going up and everything, marble staircase. It was quite impressive. Now, I should clarify, my mom didn't believe in spiritual things at that time, and my mom could be very harsh. She had a kind of a harsh way about her, and she was always very concerned about appearances and what people would think. And so how we presented ourselves and how we talked in public and everything mattered a lot to her, And so, of course, for myself, it didn't matter that much to me, and I'd say whatever I said or what I didn't care. So that used to put me in conflict with her sometimes. She was one of those, what would the neighbors think type people, What will people think? Oh, stop that. People will think you're crazy. Stop talking like that. Stop talking stupid. People hear you, they think you're crazy. And all that. That's kind of how she was. Anyway, so we get in there, and right away I had a bad feeling about the place. My eyes are burning and watering. I think the heater might be putting out some fumes that I don't like. Yeah. Usually when my eyes start burning and watering this way, it means that the heater's acting up. There's Rocky in his box. Anyway, my mom, I told my mom, I said, I don't like this, I don't like, I don't like the place. And of course, what I meant was I didn't like the atmosphere. I didn't like how the feeling of the place. It wasn't that I didn't think that the building was impressive or whatever, but of course, my mom wasn't really a believer in an atmosphere or a feeling or whatever, so she just said, she said, stop, just stop it. She said, like, what do you mean you don't like the place? It's a beautiful place, Stop talking stupid, basically is what she said, Stop talking stupid. And so I took my sister, like kids will do, and we went exploring the building. And I found a winding staircase that went down to the bottom of the building. So of course we had to go down there and see what was down there. Like I say, I had a bad feeling about the place right from the start. But anyway, at a winding staircase there, and we go down it. This was a different staircase. It was like we used to call it the back staircase. It wasn't the grand staircase at the front of the building. Anyway, we go down this staircase, and when we got to the bottom of it, it opened up into the basement. And there was a hallway, and across the hallway from the opening of the staircase was the boiler room. Well, the big doors to the boiler room, the big fire doors, were propped open. This was in May of 1980. The doors were propped open, and my sister was behind me, so she couldn't see what I was seeing. All she saw was the back end of me, basically, because she was only 3 years old, and I was standing in front of her. Well, what I saw was a beautiful blonde-haired girl, really pretty, and her hair kind of flowed down over her body. I couldn't tell you if she was wearing clothes because I couldn't see any clothes. It was like her hair was her clothing, So I couldn't tell if she had a dress on underneath her hair or what. I couldn't see anything. All I could see was this beautiful, long, flowing blonde hair that went right down to her feet. That's all I could see, anyway. And I would have figured, she looked to be about my age, about 12 years old. And I would have figured that she was just some girl who was staying there. Because bear in mind, I hadn't met anybody yet. I didn't know who was staying there and who wasn't. Normally, I would have thought she was just some girl who was staying there. She was perfectly solid. You couldn't see through her or anything. But what gave me a clue that there was something odd going on, and like I say, I was already not feeling good about the place, but what gave me a clue there was something odd going on was she was floating a couple of feet off the floor. She was there by the big boiler, by the big heating boiler, and she was floating a couple of feet off the floor. And I knew that wasn't normal. You know, people don't just hover or levitate off the floor like that. And so I grabbed my sister's hand and I dragged her up all those stairs, pretty much bounced her up them. You know, she didn't like that much. She cried and everything, and I got into a lot of trouble for that, for dragging my sister up the stairs like that, you know. I was in a panic, though. I saw that, and it scared me half to death, you know, and I got up the stairs. Anyway, here we were anyway, that happened. Well, then, after a few days, I had to get enrolled in the school next door in St. James the Lesser School. And I hated that school with a passion. I really did. I just really hated it. I used to think, yeah, it's even named after a lesser saint, you know, St. James the Lesser. You know, it figures it'd be named after an inferior saint, you know. But anyway, I used to think that, you know. My first day of school, I was brought up to the classroom where I was going to be, and I met the teacher. She was an older woman, short, kind of a pudgy, white-haired woman, and her name was Mrs. White. Anyway, I was brought up to the classroom by the principal, and when I got up there, well, I'll tell you, the first part of the story is I had to walk from the convent over to the school. And there was a fenced-in yard at the side of the school. You went in through a gate to get into the yard. So I go into this yard, and I see there's a bunch of kids I don't know, because I'm the new guy. I have no idea who anybody is. But what stood out to me is there was this one kid, and he's laying down in the dust on his belly, and he's, you know, drawn in the dust with a stick. He just had a twig or whatever from a tree, and he's drawn in the dust with the stick. And the guy was over 6 feet tall, and I swear he must have weighed 300 pounds. The guy was built like a friggin' refrigerator. He really was. Like, I mean, and the school only went up to grade 8, you know. Anyway, I see this guy, and I thought, oh, God, what have I gotten into? What kind of a place is this, you know? Because that was the first thing I saw. Anyway, after I'd been at the school for a while, I eventually screwed up my courage and went over to see what this big guy was doing. This guy never spoke. I never heard him say a word. I don't even know if he could talk. Really, maybe he couldn't. But he either couldn't talk or he had nothing to say. I don't know. But anyway, every recess and every lunch hour, he'd be out there on his belly, drawn in the dust with a stick. One day I got my courage screwed up, and I thought, I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to see what this guy is actually doing, what he's drawn. And what he'd do is he'd draw a picture with a stick, and then he'd take his hand and he'd you know, obliterate it, and then he'd draw something else. This is what he did. That guy was an artist. if you could see the stuff he was drawing, it just in the dust with a stick, it was truly amazing. That guy, that great big guy, who, when I saw him, first time I saw him, the first thing I thought was, basically, and I know I shouldn't say this, but this is what I thought. I'm being honest here. I thought, what the hell? Look at that big retard laying there in the dust. What have I gotten into here? That's the first thing I thought. And that's just the truth. That's what I thought. It was 1980, and we still use words like retard and so on. And that's what I thought. I thought, oh my, what, look at the retard. Look at that great big retard laying in the dust, in the dirt. They are drawn on with a stick, Anyway, it ended up, though, he was an artist. Like, just doing that, you'd have to have seen it to know. I wish I had pictures of the stuff he was drawing, because I'd never be able to describe it to you. But that guy, he had real talent. I don't know if he went on to be an artist or not. Maybe he did. I just don't know. I don't even know if he's still alive. A lot of the time, people who are really big like that have a very short life. So I don't know. Anyway, all I can tell you was, he'd have been around my age. He'd been around 12 years old. And he was built, though, like a friggin' 35-year-old pro wrestler or something, I mean, the guy was huge. He was just massive. And it wasn't even so much that he was fat. He's a little pudgy for sure, but it wasn't really like he was fat. He was just big. He was just a really big guy. Anyway, back to my story. I get taken up to the classroom by the principal of the school. He was a nice man. I actually come to really like the principal, and I'll tell you why later on in the story, how I got to know the principal a bit and how I come to really like him. But anyway, he introduced me to Mrs. White, the teacher, and then he left me there with her. So I'm now standing in the front of the room in front of all these kids I don't know, with this teacher I don't know. And Mrs. White introduces me to the class. And she says, this is the son of one of those whores next door who made the sisters leave the convent. And then she said to me, you can take the empty desk behind the filthy Indian boy if you can stand the smell of him. There was an empty desk. There was a native boy sitting there, and there was an empty desk behind him in the far corner of the room. She told me I could sit there. So I hear the water running through the roof onto the... there's always something, it seems. Here we go. It's dripping somewhere. Where are you dripping? Oh, there we go. There it is back in there. Wonderful. I can't even go back there to do anything about it. All right. Well, we'll just have to accept that that's how that is. Anyway, it ended up, that's a new leak, actually. That wasn't there before. But anyway, so I sit down behind this kid. Now, he didn't smell or anything, but she said he did, of course, because he was native, or she said Indian, then it would be a rule that he'd have to stink, because that's just an arbitrary rule, I guess. Anyway, this Mrs. White had an awful hate on for me right from the start, because she hated my mother. Even though she didn't know my mother, she hated her, because she hated all the people over there at the convent, because she blamed the people in the shelter for the fact that the sisters weren't in there anymore. And so she had a real hate on for me. Anyway, at lunchtime, I'd go back over to the convent there, to the old convent, and I'd have my lunch. And I loved to get out of that school. I hated that school with a passion, so I was always happy to get out of there. And so I'd go back over and have my lunch. And then, of course, I had to go back, which I hated. But there was one day at lunchtime, she dismissed the class, and she says, you You stay. She said, I want to talk to you. So anyway, everybody else went out, and she said, okay. She said, come here. She was sitting at her desk at the front of the room. She said, come here and stand in front of me. So I went over and I stood there, and she said, no, I'm going to put some questions to you, and you're going to answer them, because she said, I want some answers. I said, well, I'll do my best. What do you want to know? And she says, can you see your face in the floors over at the old convent? I didn't know what she meant. I kind of was baffled. So she asked me again, only more aggressively. I asked you, can you see your face in the floors over there at the convent? And I said, I don't know what you're asking me. And she says, oh, good God. She says, okay, I'll explain it to you. When the sisters were there, they kept that place so clean, and they kept those floors polished. And so when you went in there, you could see your reflection in the floors. What I'm asking you is, can you still see your reflection in the floors if you go over there? And I said, well, no, ma'am, you can't. I said, the floor, she says, well, no, ma'am, you can't. And she says, oh, so they keep the place like a pigsty. And I said, no, ma'am, that's not what I said. They keep the floors clean, but no, they don't have them polished that you can see your face in them. These were marble floors, in the old convent, And they were clean, but they weren't polished and buffed, that they were like a mirror or whatever, but they were clean. Anyway, she says, well, all right, then I'll ask you another question. Do men ever come to visit? I said, well, sometimes relations of people that are staying there or whatever will come to visit, and sometimes they are men. She'll say, that's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you, do men ever come to visit? I said, well, I just answered you. Yes, men do come to visit. She says, those aren't the kind of men I'm talking about. I'll ask you this. She said, do men ever spend the night there? I said, no, that never happens. She said, I don't believe you. You're lying to me. She said, your mother and all the other women over there are nothing but whores. And she said, I know what goes on over there, so don't you dare lie to me. And I said, I'm not lying to you, ma'am. I'm telling you the truth. Men do not stay overnight. They sometimes come to visit, but they do not stay overnight. She said, you're a liar. She said, the sight of you sickens me. Go. She said, I don't even want to look at you. Go. So I went over and I had my lunch. But anyway, that was just one example of, the level of hatred that woman possessed anyway. There was one day my dad had come. He was trying to talk my mom into going back with him, and she wasn't going to do that, and so he left. My little sister was a real daddy's girl. She had a really good relationship with our dad, and she missed him. She used to cry herself to sleep every night, wanting her papa. She called him Papa, and she always wanted her papa, And it was really hard on her what was going on, and of course, we weren't really equipped to comfort her very well or anything. I was protective of her, and I did my best, but I didn't know how to comfort her. And of course, her burden was that she didn't really understand what was going on or know what was going on. And that's a tough thing. My burden was I did understand what was going on, and I did know what was going on. And that was also a tough thing because I knew the kind of danger we were in. I understood how perilous our situation was at that moment in time. you know. So, I mean, I had the opposite problem. She knew too little, and I knew too much, you know. But anyway, she had gaffled on to this big wheel tricycle. Remember those plastic tricycles they used to have with the big wheel in the front of them? She gaffled on to one of those that was over there at the convent. And I don't know where it came from, or I have no idea, but she found it anyway, and she claimed it as her own. And that was her thing to ride around on. Well, I hear through the open window, I hear the wheels of that thing on the gravel street. At that time, that Queen Street there was all gravel. And I hear her, it's paved now, but it was gravel back then. And I hear her screaming, "Papa, come back," and crying. And I thought, oh, damn, she's out on the street. It was almost lunchtime. The high school kids used to get into their old jalopies. And because that street was gravel, what they'd do is they'd come down another side street that was paved. It went straight downhill, and then they'd hook a sharp left turn on the Queen Street, and they'd go flying past the convent and the school. And of course, the car would be fishtailing and stuff. You know, they were driving old 50s and 60s cars, you know, and this is what they'd do, the high school kids. Well, I was afraid that my sister would be out there on a big wheel and she'd get run over by a 55 Ford, you know, or something. The boy driving the car wouldn't see her until it was too late. And try stopping one of those things on gravel when you're speeding, you know. So I was concerned anyway that she was going to get flattened by a car. And anyway, I heard her crying and yelling, so I got up to look out the window, and of course, Mrs. White, I was at the back of the classroom. I only had to move a few paces to look out the window. Mrs. White, she yelled at me. She said, "You sit down. You were not given leave to get up out of your seat. You sit down." Just like that. Of course, I'd saw what my sister was up to out there. She had followed my dad's car. She'd been chasing my dad's car, is what it was, when he left, you know. Anyway, I told her, I said, I've got to go get her off the road. I said, she'll get run over out there. I got to go get her. "You will do no such thing. You will take your seat. You will sit down." Like that. And I said, "No, ma'am. I got to get my sister off the road." I said, "She's going to get run over out there." So I go and I get her off the road, bring her back and turn her over to my mom. And then I go back to school. And of course, I know there's going to be a scene, you know. And sure enough, I get back up into the classroom and Mrs. White is standing there. She meets me at the door and she's furious. And she says, "You get yourself down to the principal's office and you tell him that I said you're to receive a strapping for disobeying me and for leaving the school grounds without permission." So I go downstairs anyway and go down to the principal's office. And the principal, anyway, he invites me in. He said, "What's going on?" I told him, I said, "Mrs. White sent me down here to be strapped." And he said, "Oh, okay. Well, before I strap you, though, I'd like to know what's going on." He said, sit down in the chair there and tell me what's happened." He said, "I'm not just going to strap you when I don't even know why I'm strapping you." So he said, "Sit down and tell me what's up." So I did. I told him the story. And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "I'm not going to strap you for that." He said, "You did right." You know, he said, "There's nothing wrong with what you did." He said, "You did exactly what you should have done, and I'm not going to strap you for that." He said, "You go back up there and you tell Mrs. White that there'll be no strapping, and that if she has an issue with that, she can come see me." So that's what I did. I went upstairs, and when I went upstairs, she was standing there. "So did you get strapped? Did you get strapped?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I didn't." And she says, What? What do you mean you didn't get strapped? Why not? And I said, I can't remember the principal's name now, but I said, Mr. So-and-so said that there'd be no strapping and that if you have a problem with that, you can talk to him about it. Well, take your seat, she said like that. Anyway, that was just another experience with Mrs. White. Anyway, one night, though, my sister had been put to bed early. The way it was is my mom had the room, and my mom and my sister were in a room in the back corner of the building on the third floor. I was in a room across the hall, but one door up. So I wasn't in the back. I wasn't in the front corner of the building, but I was in the room beside the front corner of the building. So basically, my room was here. My mom and my sister's room was over here, across the hall, down the hall and across. Anyway, my mom had put my sister to sleep in a cot in the corner of the room, in their room. And then she had went back downstairs for a while. Well, she came back up to go to bed herself later that night. And when she come back up, my sister's laying there awake. This was hours after she'd been put to bed. And she says to my mom, she says, there was a lady in the room. And my mom right away thought that somebody in there had gotten into the room and was looking around to see what they could steal. So my mom says there was. Well, what did she look like? Because she wanted to figure out who had been snooping around in her room. And my sister says she had beautiful long yellow hair. She was really pretty, she said, and she had beautiful long yellow hair. Well, that's the girl that I saw in the boiler room, Anyway, my mom told her to stop talking stupid and go to sleep, basically. And so that was that. The next night, my mom's laying in bed. She's asleep, and she feels a hand, press on her shoulder. And she woke up, and the girl with the long blonde hair was floating over her bed. And when she opened her eyes and saw the girl just smiled at her and disappeared. Like she was saying, I'm here. Anyway, I found out, near to the end of our stay there, I found out the story. Apparently, everybody who stayed there would see this girl at one time or another. What had happened is, back in the 1800s, this girl had been brought there by her father to live with the nuns to straighten her out, because he said she don't act right. I don't know what she was doing or whatever, but her father said she wasn't acting right. And so it sent her to the convent to basically be straightened out by the nuns. Well, she ran away. She didn't want to be there, and she ran away. And she wasn't away very long before she got caught and brought back. And the nuns locked her up in the room where my mom and my sister ended up staying. They locked that girl up in that room. Anyway, that girl, she had jumped out the window and she had died. To get out of the room, she'd literally went through the window and she died anyway. And I don't know if she was trying to climb down the wall maybe or something. I don't know, or if she purposely just jumped knowing she was going to die, but she did die. And apparently everybody sees this apparition now anyway that goes there. That was there. Now the building's gone now, but I mean, when it was still there. Anyway, I'll tell you the story about how I had a little job there. I was in charge of the library. They had a beautiful library that was on the second floor. And my job was to keep the library clean and to keep the books organized and to water the plants. Had a little watering can there, to water the plants with. And every day, one of those watering cans with the long spout that you can get into the potted plant with, tip it, and it goes into the potted plant easily. Anyway, was watering the. I went in there one Saturday afternoon. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Now this convent, this library was on the second floor. There was a screen door. There was a door with a screen door that looked out onto the roof of the kitchen, where you could actually go out onto the roof of the kitchen through that door. And there were high windows that went from about 3 feet above the floor right to the ceiling. And this room had high ceilings. Ceilings in that building were high. Anyway, it was a beautiful room, and it had couches and potted plants and hanging plants and stuff, and of course the shelves with the books. Well, I did all my work. I cleaned the library, swept it all, cleaned it all, dusted it all, watered the plants, all that. I had opened up that door with the screen door there just to get some air flowing through, and I had opened up some of the windows. And after I did my work, I took a book off a shelf, and I sat down on one of the couches, and I was reading this book. Well, I look up from the book, and the room is completely dark. And my first thought was, I've been reading this book for so long, and that would happen to me sometimes. I'd get reading a book and hours would go by and I wouldn't realize it's gotten dark. Except that in the windows, the light was coming as far as the windows, but it wasn't coming into the room. So I could see that it was daylight outside, but the room itself was dark. And in front of me, and right in front of one of the windows, there was a man, and he was wearing a long black robe type deal, like a priest would wear. And this blonde-haired girl that I'd seen, before, and that my mom had seen, and my sister had seen, everybody had seen her, was on her knees in front of this priest, and the priest has his hands around his throat, and he's choking her. Well, I saw that, and of course, I jumped up off the couch, and I ran out into the hallway, slammed the door behind me, and I stayed out in the hallway just scared for a few minutes. I had to screw up my courage. Then I thought, well, I got to go back in there because I've left the windows open and the door open and everything, so I got to go back in there. So I screwed up my courage, and I opened up the door. I was terrified of what I'd see. But I opened up the door and I went back in, and everything was normal. It was perfectly fine. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened, there. But anyway, I closed up all the windows, and I closed the door, and I didn't, I got out of there, I did, I got out of there. And I didn't want to tell people what I'd saw, but I was terrified to go back into that room. And so I just said that I didn't want to look after the library anymore, but I'd never say why. And it was funny, they never questioned it. It's almost like they knew something had happened, and they didn't question it. But anyway, that's what happened there. But we were there for a couple months, May and June of 1980. And this was some of the goings on anyway that we experienced there. It's funny, there was a woman took the room next door to me, directly across from my mother. And this woman, I remember, she drove an old Hornet car. Anybody remembers the old Hornet cars? That's what she drove. And it was a green Hornet, And I remember one time she took us on a trip with her. She took us on a drive in the car. And of course, we were glad to go somewhere because we were kind of stuck there, So we were pretty happy to get out in the car. So we gladly accepted. Anyway, my mom, my sister, and I, and this woman were in this woman's car in her Hornet, and going down the road. And we stopped at a little rest area. It was like a little park area, and there was water there. I don't know now if it was a lake or a river, but there was water there. Well, this woman, she gets out of the car and she runs with fully clothed into the water. And she's splashing around in the water and everything, and she's telling us we should go in too. Well, I notice there's a sign on a post, and it says, warning. You know, the water, basically what it said is that the water was contaminated with beaver lice. And so, of course, we weren't going in, and the sign was facing away from the water. So I said to my mom, I said, there's beaver lice in the water here, according to the sign. So then my mom and I are trying to yell at this woman to come out of there because the water's contaminated. And of course, she's not really listening to us. And my sister, my little sister, she's grabbing on to the pole of the sign, to the wooden post the sign was nailed to. And she's trying to turn the sign around. And there's beaver lice, see? And she's trying to turn the sign around, which of course didn't work. But that's what she was trying to do, turn the whole post and everything around so that the sign was facing the water, so this woman could read the sign. But obviously that didn't work. But it was kind of cute anyway. She was trying to turn the sign, only 3 years old, you know. You know, there's beaver lice, see? And she's trying to turn the sign. Anyway, that was just one story. Another story is there was a Pentecostal woman that had come into the place. Her and her husband weren't actually split up, but they were pretending they were split up because we were in an economic recession at the time, and Renfrew County got hit really hard. Anyway, they lost most of their manufacturing, and her husband lost his job in the factory. And welfare wasn't paying very much, you know. And so what they did is they pretended to be split up so he could draw welfare, and so that she could also draw assistance. So they didn't lose their house. They had a couple of little girls. They were just toddlers, the little girls. Anyway, I was a devout Catholic at the time. This woman took over the kitchen, and she used to play gospel music all the time. She had a tape recorder there, and she'd play gospel music tapes all the time in the kitchen. Of course, I used to go out the side kitchen door every Saturday night to go to Mass up the hill at the Catholic Church. This woman didn't like that. She'd see me leaving there wearing a suit and know I was going to Mass, and it bothered her. So she'd stand in front of the door and try to make me not go to Mass. Anyway, one day it had just got to be too much for me, and I said, listen, you have your religion, I have mine. I'm going to Mass. So I said, please get out of my way. Because she was going on, I'm not going to let you go to that Roman temple and all this business. Anyway, she decided that I was demonically possessed because I was going to Mass all the time and because I had defied her by telling her to get out of my way. I did it respectfully, but still, I told her to get out of my way. And she did get out of my way. But then she was convinced that I was demonically possessed. So she convinced she convinced my mother that I had to be taken to the Pentecostal church. Well, the following Saturday, her husband Delmer came up. His name was Delmer, I remember that. He came up, and he had a beat-up old van. He had a 1959 Ford van, which had holes in the roof and everything, you know. And he came up in his van, and my mom informed me that we were going to a service at the Pentecostal church in Renfrew. Well, I didn't want to go. Really, I wasn't supposed to go. In those days, if you were Catholic, you had to have a special dispensation from the bishop to go to another church for any reason. But anyway, he came. I was told I had no choice. I was going. So we end up in this van. It's pouring rain. I'm sitting on the spare tire in the back of the van, and the rain is pouring down through the roof on top of me, on my head. So by the time we got there, I was soaked to the skin, and it was all dirty, rusty water and stuff, you know. So I didn't look very good by the time we got there. Well, we get in there, and they have this woman up front preaching, and of course, she's a hellfire and brimstone type, so she's roaring at the congregation. And there's people taking, like, almost like they were taking seizures and stuff. There were people rolling around on the floor. There was all kinds of stuff, which I wasn't used to as a Catholic. There was a woman behind me, and I swear she sounded like she was having an orgasm, you know, and stuff. And it was just really weird anyway. To me, it was. I mean, I understand to them it wasn't weird, but to me it was. And I felt really out of place. So I'm there anyway, and I'm just really not happy about being there, Well, all of a sudden, this woman preacher, she points at me, and she says, "We have an unbeliever amongst us." And then the ushers come, and they grab me up, and they take me downstairs. And the ladies' room in this place had a powder room. There was when you first went in there was like a room that had little makeup tables and mirrors and stuff and couches to sit on. And then beyond that was the place where the actual toilets were and stuff. Well, they took me into the ladies' room, into the powder room portion of it, and they surrounded me, and they had their hands on me, and now they're trying to get me to agree to become a Pentecostal, and telling me that I was possessed with demons and that I was going to burn in hell unless I joined them, and telling me how much they loved me and how they didn't want me to burn in hell and all that. And I was refusing to have anything to do with it, but I had no choice but to stand there. I was surrounded by these guys. And they went at me for hours and hours. It was like 7 o'clock in the evening when they took me down there, and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning when they finally let me go. And I remember that anyway. It was like either 3 or 4 in the morning, the following morning. Anyway, that's just another example anyway. And I was standing there the whole time with these guys. And in fact, they wouldn't let me go to the bathroom. I ended up pissing my pants at everything because they wouldn't let me go to the bathroom. And it was an ordeal anyway. It went on for hours and hours. But I say from 7 o'clock until either 3 or 4 in the morning. But anyway, I remember that. That was another thing that happened at that time. Anyway, we're up to nearly an hour now, so I'm going to shut this down. But that was just some of what happened to me back in 1980, some of what happened to my family and so on. Yeah, all right. We'll talk later, I guess.